Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about Russian economy because over the last few days we've seen something rather unusual. Every year Russia holds what is effectively its version of Davos, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, or SPIEF. This is the event where government ministers, central bankers, business leaders, economists and foreign investors gather to discuss the future of the Russian economy. And President Putin always gives a trademark speech at the beginning of it. And normally these events are full of optimism, lots of ambitious targets, lots of announcements, speeches about future growth and opportunity. But this year's forum felt very different. Instead of talking about rapid expansion, many of the discussions centered around slowing growth. Instead of talking about economic success, officials were warning about stagnation. And instead of talking about investment opportunities, senior bankers and business leaders were openly discussing recession risks and structural problems. And perhaps most importantly of all, some of Russia's most senior economic figures appear to be admitting that the wartime economic model, which has supported growth over the last few years, is now running out of steam. So in this video, I want to go through exactly what was said at the forum, why it matters and why Russia could now be entering a very difficult economic period. But before we get into the details, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please take a second to hit that red subscriber button. It really does help me with the algorithm, also puts a smile on my face. And also I wanted to mention that the competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize is now coming to a conclusion. It finishes on Friday the 12th of June, so there's only a few days left now, so you won't hear me saying this very much longer. But if you haven't got involved and you'd like to and support the channel, please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. And good luck to everybody who's entered or who's going to enter. Everybody's got an equal chance of winning. So let's get into the details. For the past 3 years, Russia has managed to surprise many spectators. When the sanctions were first imposed after the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of analysts expected a severe economic collapse to happen very quickly. But that didn't happen. Instead, the economy continued to grow. Factories remained open, unemployment fell, government revenue held up better than many expected. And the Kremlin repeatedly pointed to this as proof that the sanctions had failed. But there was a major catch. Much of that growth was driven by the government spending, particularly military spending, the switch to a wartime economy. The state poured vast sums of money into defense production. Factories producing tanks, shells, missiles and military equipment operated around the clock. Large number of workers were recruited into military industrial complexes. Defense orders surged, government spending also boomed, and GDP followed suit. The problem with this model is that war spending creates growth but doesn't create prosperity. It makes economic statistics look impressive, but underlying weaknesses continue building beneath the surface. And that's what's been happening in Russia over the past few years. One of the most striking things about the SPIEF conference this year is the growing number of officials openly acknowledging that growth is now slowing sharply. After expanding by 4% in 2024, growth has slowed significantly in 2025. The most recent data suggests that there now might actually be a contraction in the first quarter of 2026. And forecasts for the rest of this year are hovering between 0 and 1%. The government recently reduced its forecast, the Russian government, to 0.4%. Now that is a dramatic slowdown. Going from 4% year on year to effectively stagnation within a 12-month period represents a major change in direction. And there are several reasons why this is happening. The first is interest rates. Russia's central bank was forced to raise interest rates aggressively in an attempt to control inflation. Those high rates have made borrowing very expensive in Russia, so consumers are borrowing less and therefore spending less. Businesses are doing the same. Investment projects have been delayed or cancelled, and economic activity as a result is slowing. And this issue has become so severe that some of Russia's largest companies are now openly criticising economic policy. At the SPIEF conference, several leading businessmen complained that current monetary policy has damaged investment and is choking their growth. One described the situation as an economic trap. Now, if we just think about that, these aren't opposition politicians. These are some of the country's most powerful business leaders, the oligarchs. When people who generally supported the system begin publicly criticizing economic policy at Russia's flagship investment forum that the whole world is watching, it tells you that concerns are spreading well beyond economists and analysts. The second major issue is investment, and this is possibly the most important problem. VTB, the Russian bank, reported that investment spending fell by more than 14% in the first quarter of this year. Meanwhile, Sberbank, the largest bank, reported that investment has now been declining for 4 consecutive quarters. Now, this matters enormously because investment is the fuel that drives future growth. Investment means new factories, new equipment, new technology, new infrastructure, new productive capacity. Without investment, future growth becomes increasingly difficult to achieve. An economy can survive weak growth for a while. What it can't survive indefinitely is falling investment, because investment today is growth tomorrow. And right now, Russia is sacrificing tomorrow's growth in order to pay for today's military spending. The third problem is labour shortages. Hundreds of thousands of workers, potentially over 1 million, have either joined the military, left the country, or have been absorbed into defence industries. So they're working in those factories, making things for the war effort. As a result, companies are having to compete aggressively to hire workers. Wages have risen rapidly, but productivity has not increased at the same pace. The result is higher costs, lower efficiency, and additional inflationary pressure. And then we come on to the issue of the ruble, which we've discussed a lot. One of the strongest aspects of the Russian economy over the last year or so has been the strength of the currency, in theory. Normally, countries facing sanctions, budget pressures, and weaker export revenue see their currencies weaken significantly. But Russia has experienced the exact opposite. But this isn't really a normal free market currency anymore. Capital controls and government intervention play a major role in determining the exchange rate. The result is the ruble appears strong on paper, but creates significant problems for exporters. Oil and gas are sold internationally in dollars. When those dollars are converted back into rubles, a strong ruble means exporters receive less rubles in return, and this is what they have to show in their accounts and on their balance sheet. So that reduces profitability, which in turn reduces tax revenues because you pay tax on your profits, and it creates additional pressure throughout the whole of the economy. And that brings us to another important development. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak confirmed this week that oil production is now lower than it was at the start of 2026. Now that matters because oil and gas remain the foundation of government finances. The Russian budget was already under pressure from lower energy prices at the start of this year. However, now production itself is falling. So revenues are being squeezed from multiple directions at the same time. We've got lower volumes, reduced profitability, a stronger ruble, and continuing spending commitments. At the same time, military expenditure remains extraordinarily high. The government continues spending enormous sums supporting the war in Ukraine, and this is creating another challenge. Resources are finite. Workers, there's only a limited number of them. There's only a limited amount of capital. There's only so much machinery that can go around. And unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, they don't have access to the global technology market, so it has a limited amount of technology. Every worker that's building military equipment is a worker that isn't helping to grow the economy in other sectors. Every ruble invested in military production is a ruble that isn't being invested into the growth of Russia. Economists are now referring to this as crowding out, and many analysts believe it's increasingly visible across the Russian economy. Civilian industries are struggling, private investment is weakening, productivity remains poor, and the economy is increasingly dependent on government funding. The concern raised by many participants at the SPIEF conference is that this model may simply have reached its limit. Another warning sign is coming from demographics. Recent reports show that Russia's birth rate have fallen to its lowest level in 200 years. Now that is an extraordinary statistic, and it remains a long-term challenge that can't be solved quickly. Fewer births today mean fewer workers in the future. That means fewer taxpayers, fewer consumers, and ultimately slower economic growth for the whole of Russia. Russia was already facing demographic challenges before the war started because of the birth rate and the death rate. The combination of emigration, military mobilization, and the declining birth rates is making the situation significantly worse. Even if all of Russia's economic problems disappeared tomorrow, which they won't, demographic pressures would continue for decades. And that's one of the reasons why many economists believe the country faces structural challenges rather than simply short-term economic difficulties. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is the change in tone. For years, the message coming from Russia has been remarkably consistent. Sanctions have failed, the economy is resilient, everything is under control, growth is strong, it's all good. But this year, the conversations are very different. Senior bankers are discussing stagnation, business leaders are discussing falling investment, economists are discussing recession risks, government officials are discussing the need for a new growth strategy, and even Kremlin advisors have begun talking about the need for fundamental rethink on the economic model going forward. Now that is a significant shift because the SPIEF conference is not a gathering of Kremlin critics, it's Russia's premier investment conference. Its purpose is to showcase that confidence and to attract investment and to demonstrate economic strength. So when concerns emerge from within that environment, they become much more difficult to dismiss. President Putin himself continued to project confidence during his trademark speech. He spoke about resilience, international partnerships, and Russia's future role in the global economy. But behind the headlines, many of the discussions were focused on much more uncomfortable realities. The easy gains appear to have been exhausted, the wartime economic boost is now fading, growth is slowing, investment is falling, oil revenues are under pressure, demographic challenges are worsening, and some of Russia's financial institutions are now openly discussing stagnation. The big question is what happens next. Can the Kremlin engineer a transition from a wartime economy towards a more sustainable growth model? Can investment return despite sanctions and uncertainty? Can productivity improve despite labour shortages? Can the budget cope with lower energy revenues and continued military spending? Those questions all remain unanswered. But one thing has become very clear this week. For the first time in a long time, the conversation at Russia's biggest economic forum was not about how strong the economy is, it was about whether the current model is beginning to break down. And that is a discussion that could become louder and louder over the next few months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.